Hey everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing El Topo. This film came out in 1970. It was written and directed and scored by and starring Alejandro Jodorowsky. It's hard to put your finger on Jodorowsky as a man and as an artist because he does so many things. He's a surrealist, absurdist artist. He is a writer. He's an actor. He's a mime. He's a puppeteer, a filmmaker, a musician, a spiritual guru, a messiah, maybe one of the three wise men reincarnated, I'm not quite sure. He has such a strong artistic background, a performance art background, and he's used to being around a bunch of very eccentric people, a bunch of outcasts, misfits. He spent time in a performance troupe for a while, and then he eventually became a disciple of a Zen Buddhist. So he had quite a varied life, a unique life. I think he's a curious man, very unabashed and really unafraid to express his beliefs as strongly as he can. And the philosophy behind all of his films, to me, are the real heartbeat of his work. His films are very Eastern influenced, Eastern philosophy, and very rooted in spirituality. And when you watch his movies, it's almost like you're treading through some really hot, humid, deep jungle, and you're kind of releasing the toxins within as you get deeper into it. And El Topo is perhaps Jodorowsky's most personal work. It does have a lot of mirroring of his own self-exploration, and he does star in the film as well, so there's, the implications there. El Topo is one of the first ever midnight movies, which was a term coined for movies that were playing in the late hours that were not for the kiddies. It's one of those novelties I would love to take part in, but not now, like back in the day with all those suntanned 1970s kids dropping acid. Can you imagine being on acid in the middle of the 1970s where it was like the Old West and you just walk in to a movie theater and El Topo is playing? It would be like wandering into some weird dimension where this Jodorowsky fellow is trying to bring you into some mystical hypnosis. It's void-like and otherworldly and yet somehow very sharp in terms of its effect on you. It feels very rooted within the flesh as well. And it's not just a fantasy film. I mean, it's a fantasy film that's mixed with reality, and reality is mixing in with fantasy. So to me, it is the ultimate trip, and you can really project yourself onto it. We're kind of drifting through this weird kind of self-exploration, this void that is represented by this desert setting. But I love the setting of it because, the desert is so blank, and so it's so easy to project your own spiritual and psychedelic feelings onto it, and that mirage quality to it makes everything seem like it's not quite real. El Topo is also an acid western, which is a term that was coined by Pauline Kael, fun fact, when she reviewed the film. The genre itself is pretty self-explanatory, but it's taking a lot of the moral ideas and a lot of those cliches in American westerns that we've seen, subverting them. But also it's looking at the spaghetti westerns, even like the great ones of Sergio Leone, and then subverting those. I look at a movie like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which I reviewed quite recently, and yeah, it's a response to American westerns in the sense that it is more internal, more complex, and then this one is trying to take that even further in more of a psychedelic sense. It's not just questioning morality and the darkness within like that film, but it's questioning just existence as an idea and facing the self, traveling through the 7 circles of hell in order to gain some sort of meaning, or maybe realize that there is no meaning. Our main character is doing so much more introspection. He's shaving his head and shedding his material possessions and being reborn into life with a certain clarity that he hadn't had before. And the film is very much an odyssey in the biblical sense, certainly mirroring a lot of stories we've seen in the Bible, but warped and filtered through this sort of fever dream where all the imagery and the senses are running together and you're sort of just breaking through them, ripping through them. It's all a very abstract experience. A lot of the images you can never take at face value, and the way they kind of overlap, it almost feels like it's layering over you, and a lot of feelings get evoked from these images, and it feels like it's almost shooting through you in a primal sense, in a ritualistic sense. It's also quite similarly structured to The Holy Mountain, which came out a few years later that he did, in the sense that your main character, your hero, is pushing through all these different phases of life, encountering all the typical things you do in life, experiencing the spectrum of emotions and struggles. You're experiencing it in a body sense through the human flesh before reaching that peak and learning to let go of those material possessions. Though I would say that The Holy Mountain is more blatantly a psychedelic movie. It's more self-aware and shameless in that sense. So if that's something that you're more into, then The Holy Mountain may fit your taste more. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. But El Topo, I think, is more cohesive. It's sort of blending a lot of the narrative with the philosophy, so it exists more as an allegory. But that feeling, that psychedelic feeling that all of Jodorowsky movies give you, and certainly in this film, it's very important because it is that existential examination, which is very similar to a psychedelic experience, and it's perfect for the cinematic experience because both kind of feed into each other, the psychedelic and the cinematic. In many ways, they are very connected, especially because they're all connected to our dreams. And as we are living kind of vicariously through this cowboy dressed in black, where he's seeing all this behavior around him from different people, all kinds of different scenarios and people he's encountering, you know, we learn a lot. I mean, everything is going to be very exaggerated and twisted because this is, you know, more of an over-the-top experience. So we're seeing a lot of crudeness and fetishes, violence, love affair, abandonment, etc. And yet you're not ever quite sure what's real and whether or not it's all a dream or not. It's like having your feet in two worlds where you're weaving between reality and fantasy and just trying to anchor yourself. But all of these scenarios are so full of so many different emotions all over the spectrum. Humor is a big one. Jodorowsky is definitely a satirist, exaggerating the human experience to be able to examine it, but it can so quickly go from a transcendent feeling to something that can be really sadistically violent. It can be really calm, and then all of a sudden it's really jarring, painful, and then suddenly it's slapstick humor. And there's lots of phallic jokes and phallic imagery in particular, but the fact that you can see violence, rape, and slapstick humor all within one scene is really remarkable, but I think it's so integral to the Jodorowsky philosophy, blending of the sensory emotion so you can push through to a lot of more infinite possibilities. The rush of consciousness as you're beginning to break through to something that is more meaningful and more important. Jodorowsky loves to make commentary on consumerism in his movies, the weakness of humans and their need to fit in, their attachment to the external world. And when the cowboy returns to that town in the third act of the movie, that's a perfect example of it. And you see that eye symbol all over the place because it's sort of exploited more as an advertisement, more for selfish gain. There is a scene I really liked in the movie where there's all these old, fat, rich women and they come on to this African-American male and they assault him, but then they blame him for coming on to them. And of course, who's gonna get blamed for it? Of course, the one who nobody believes. And it's that kind of disgusting behavior, that hateful behavior that is rarely explored in this way. It kind of, again, is subverting your expectations. It's more raw. I'm never sure whether or not Jodorowsky, as the character in this movie, all the people that he's meeting, if they're real people or if they're just meant to be kind of symbolic facets that are representing that exploration of the self for him. I'm pretty sure it's aspects of both because, as an example, with the female character, Mara, you know, she begins her own journey towards self-exploration in the film as well, because when she begins, she's very submissive and she's controlled and treated poorly. She experiences a lot of violence, and yet at a certain point within that violence, she finds her own strength, her own power, and discovers her sexual pleasure in the midst of it. And that's also something that's rarely explored, where through violence in a really complex and dark way, you can, in a way, find positives in that and find your individuality. And at that point, when she does, the cowgirl shows up, who is very androgynous. She's dressed all in black, just like the Jodorowsky character, and she has a male voice. And her having that relationship with Mara is, in a sense, metaphorically speaking, Mara finding her individuality and separating herself from El Topo. But again, is there really a woman there, or is she more just kind of like an abstract symbol? Or is it more Mara is really starting to discover her individuality, and more of that naturally when a woman starts to discover that, she's discovering a bit more of a masculine side to her. And maybe Jodorowsky is starting to discover more vulnerability, which is bringing him in touch with his feminine side. So it all kind of fits together. But it can mean whatever you want it to mean in terms of your own experiences and whatever you take away from the film. With Jodorowsky, I feel like he's really using a lot of personal things throughout his life. You know, when he was learning, when he was a disciple, when he was learning about meditation, when he was working around the circus culture and the more surrealist art scene. And here he's kind of creating a narrative that helps him express all of that with fragments of all that stuff that is in his memories. In the final act of the movie, when his character goes from being this like rogue ranger badass, which we're so used to seeing, that classic legendary cowboy masculine look, suddenly he's stripped away and broken down, and he is kind of reborn in a sense as the leader of a community of rejected people. And this in a sense is sort of his final judgment in terms of his self-acceptance and his acceptance of the world. There are a million things going on in this movie, so much to absorb at once. It demands multiple viewings, but yet at the same time, it's not difficult to understand. I think it feels very focused, and it remains very much an allegory. We all want an answer to something. We want the things that we can't have, the things that are out of our control, to perfect something without ever understanding why we want to perfect it. It's because we're pushing towards something that doesn't exist, a death wish of sorts. And this film to me is about pushing towards something before recognizing the meaninglessness of the search. In order to face life, you must face death. And vice versa. So as you, metaphorically speaking, beat your fists against the existential wall, and you beat until your fists are bloody, just screaming, why God, why me, why this? Your antics keep you from realizing that all of the tools you need, that you've always had access to find your own answers, are here. They're within you. I've always respected Jodorowsky for that. I've always respected his boldness in his pursuit of enlightenment, and just how free he is in terms of accepting death and accepting the meaninglessness of the ego ultimately, and expressing it through his art. Few do it with this kind of ambition, this kind of shamelessness, this kind of creativity. And it's an example of a movie I think you can really learn from and take a lot of that philosophy with you and incorporate it into your real life. And I wish more people had that sort of gift, that sort of insight into consciousness in an artistic sense. I think we could all benefit a lot from it. But yes, this is a fabulous film. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. And that is my review. Thank you all for watching. If you look here, you'll see all of my Patreon supporters. The link to support is below if you'd like to. Also, all my social media information is below that. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.